Good afternoon. Welcome to this session on using SASB standards to incorporate UN Sustainable Development Goals into investment portfolios. My name is Michael Greis. Today's session is brought to you by the CFA Society of Boston and the SASB Boston FSA City Group. I'm chair of the CFA Society of Boston's Sustainable Investing Initiative, and I'll be your moderator. To introduce the Boston FSA City Group, I'd like to turn to the group's co-chair, Denise Selden.
Hello. Good afternoon and good evening to the many attendees who have joined us today from various different time zones. Today's presentation is jointly sponsored, as Michael mentioned, by the CFA Society of Boston and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, that's SASB, through its educational and credentialing organization, the Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting, the FSA. Our webinar is titled Using SASB Standards to Incorporate UN Sustainable Development Goals into Investment Portfolios. This has been an area of great interest. Our speakers will address the overlaps between the SASB disclosure standards and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Denise Selden. I am a co-head of the SASB City Group for Boston. We are a group formed by the SASB FSA organization to create live presentations, webinars, and networking opportunities for investment professionals who are committed to sustainability, ESG, and impact investing. Members of the City Group for Boston do not need to be enrolled in the SASB FSA credentialing process, though, of course, all candidates will be included in our program and are an important source of our support. The City Group for Boston encourages membership and participation by all investment and corporate professionals interested in sustainability. We hosted a well-received live presentation late last year. Once health considerations allow, we'll return to a full mix of live and virtual events. Representatives of the SASB City Group for Boston will contact members this year to seek out ideas and topics to develop our ESG community throughout New England. We look forward to speaking to you. Eric?
Thanks, Denise. My name is Eric Weigel. I'm the other co-head of the SASB Boston City Group. So welcome, everybody. We would have loved to have done this in person, but due to current circumstances, we got to do it over Zoom. So we're all becoming experts at this. Today's topic, using SASB standards to incorporate UN Sustainable Development Goals into investment portfolios, is of great interest, not only to investors, institutional investors, as well as retail investors, but also to operating entities, whether you're for-profit, nonprofit, government entities. Everybody's looking for the use of standards. So regardless of the control point, everybody's moving from a need to state goals and disclosures to the how to state goals and disclosures using some sort of framework. In this case, SASB, GRI, and other reporting frameworks. I'd like to now pass it on to Michael.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Denise, for the introduction to the Boston FSA City Group. It probably will not surprise you to know that about a third of the current FSA certificate holders in this area are also CFA charter holders, and there's a lot of cross-interest between the two communities naturally, and so it's something we're delighted to bring together to make this connection and to talk about this topic. So briefly, the flow for this afternoon session is I will turn it over in a moment to Arturo Rodriguez from SASB, who will present the work that he did on the alignment and the connection between the SASB standards and the SDGs. And we will follow that with two of our practitioners from this area, and that would be Rakhi, Kumar, and Ivka, Kalus, who will each speak about some of the pieces of this that are of interest to them in their jobs and their work. And then we're going to have a conversation on the challenges and where we think we are, where we think we can be on making use of the SDGs in the investment process and connecting that with the SASB standards. So with that, Arturo, I'd like to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Hopefully you guys can see my screen. And if not, I'll give it 2 more seconds while I thank the CFA Society of Boston for the invitation and all the members and participants of this webinar for your interest in SASB and the FSA in particular. So the agenda for my presentation today, hopefully you can see that on your screen. I'll talk briefly about the SDGs and investor interest in the SDGs. I'll then touch upon SASB's theory of change with regards to overlaying a financial materiality lens to the SDGs and sustainable development. I'll talk a little bit about the mapping exercise that SASB conducted to establish connections between our disclosure topics and the SDG targets. I'll provide a brief summary of the results of that mapping exercise. And finally, I'll end up with a closing remarks. But let's start with item number 1 on that agenda, which is SDGs and investor interest. First of all, probably this is common knowledge for everybody in the room here, but the SDGs were created by the United Nations as part of its Agenda 2030 strategy. And it's important to know that there are 17 goals that you see there for governments. But companies and investors are also expected to contribute to achieving these global goals. The way in which these goals are organized is as follows. There's the 17 goals that are broken down into 169 targets, and each of these targets has a different number of indicators, which are basically KPIs to measure progress towards the achievement of those SDGs. And understanding how the SDG framework is constructed and the hierarchy is important because, as you'll see in a couple of slides, SASB mapped its disclosure topics at the target level that you see there. So again, different SDGs have different numbers of targets, and these targets have different numbers of indicators, and SASB has mapped its framework at the target level of the SDGs.
Now that we've seen how the SDGs are organized, let's switch gears a little bit and focus on company and investor interest in the SDG framework and the Agenda 2030. This slide shows results from 2 different surveys. On your left, you see results from the asset owner and asset manager community, representing the investor side. And on the right-hand side, you see results from a survey conducted with companies. As you can see, 65% of global asset owners and asset managers say that they have aligned their investment framework with the SDGs. Meanwhile, on the company side, 72% of companies surveyed mentioned the SDGs in their corporate or sustainability reports. So there's definitely interest in the SDG framework. And this is one of the reasons, of course, that SASB conducted its mapping effort that we'll talk about in a few more slides. In addition to these survey results, we at SASB started noticing interest in the SDG framework because back in 2018, SASB hosted an open house at our headquarters when people could get together under the same roof. We learned very quickly that investors wanted to apply the SASB financial materiality lens to the SDG framework to understand which SDGs connected in a financially material way to a company's operations and products or services.
So let me switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the theory of change expressed in the SASB publication on the SDGs. First of all, the first thing that we put forward on that theory of change is that, of course, companies can influence the SDGs through their business operations as well as their products and services. So this is nothing new, I guess, but it's important to understand that there's two main avenues, right? Direct business operations, and then the ways in which you can align yourself through your products and services. And you can see that expressed in that illustration there in that slide, where you can think of a chemicals company and think of two SASB topics in the chemical industry standard. Hazardous waste management, which of course relates to business operation, as well as product design for use phase efficiency, which relates to products and services. And you can easily see the connection between those two topics to SDG number 12, which focuses on responsible consumption as well as production. The idea here is that applying the SASB financial materiality lens to the SDGs can unlock value that is mutually beneficial to companies, shareholders, and society at large. Now, in the publication that was released a couple of months ago, when we first published published our mapping effort, we put forward this idea of the sweet spot concept, because it's important to understand that a lot of money needs to be invested in the SDGs to achieve the goals set by the 2030 agenda. Actually, the UN Commission on Trade and Development has calculated that to meet the 17 goals by 2030, between $5 and $7 trillion will be needed in investments each year. So we talked a little bit about a funding gap in our paper and put forward this idea of the sweet spot, in which overlaying the SASB materiality lens into the SDGs or the SDGs framework means that it is likely that we'll find that sweet spot in which negative impacts can be reduced, societal or environmental impacts can be reduced, positive impacts can be achieved, again, also in both the environment and society. And given SASB's financial materiality lens and focus on enterprise value creation, there's also probably an overlap to meet financial return targets. So this is a way for companies to allocate capital and resources on the SDGs that are aligned with their business strategy and financial goals and activities that are important and key to enterprise value creation. And for investors, it's a way to finance SDG-related activities that are also aligned with investment strategies and return targets.
The idea of unlocking the sweet spot to mobilize private sector investment is aligned with SASB's overarching goal of helping company investor communications. There are microeconomic drivers that create externalities with both positive and negative environmental and social impacts on the world and society. And that's the top arrow that you see in this slide here. However, there are also macroeconomic drivers that need to be internalized to understand the industry-specific risks and opportunities faced by companies. SASB's framework, through its lens on financial materiality, can help identify the most relevant SDG targets in each industry that play into these two arrows, one on the externality side, both positive and negative externalities, and also in the internalization side of risk and opportunities. SASB's industry guide to the SDGs, and of course its accompanying mapping results, seek to identify those SDG factors that are most likely related to a company's ability to create value over the long term and also improve company investor communications on the financially relevant SDG targets.
So with that in mind, let's jump into the work that we did to map the SASB standards to the SDGs. And I'll start briefly with this slide here. As FSA credential holders, you probably know how SASB organizes its data, but it's always good to refresh our memories. So we have 11 sectors, 77 industries, 5 sustainability dimensions, 26 general issue categories, which are the rows that you would see in our SASB materiality map. And then on an industry-specific lens, we have 444 disclosure topics, and each disclosure topic has its accounting metrics, which are the KPIs that we're asking companies to consider reporting for comparisons on key material issues. This structure is important to have. It is important to have this structure in mind because the mapping effort that we conducted happens at the disclosure topic level. And I mentioned before that we mapped at the SDG target level, but it's important to understand that what we mapped on the SASB side is those industry-specific disclosure topics that are a key element of the SASB standards. They bring the industry-specific nature of ESG factors into play, and that's exactly what we mapped to the SDG targets. So apart from that very important message here, it's important to understand that the SASB-SDG mapping is basically a tool that identifies connections between those industry-specific disclosure topics and the SDG targets, which can then be used and can be valuable for strategy, prioritization, and reporting in the case of companies. Now, this slide here mentions what the SASB-SDG mapping is, but it is equally important to understand what the mapping is not and the limitations of the mapping. So hopefully you're seeing this slide here, which shows a table with an example from the SASB side, from the processed food industry, and the SDGs that one of the SDGs that maps to a disclosure topic in that industry. So you see there that the processed food industry includes a health and nutrition topic that that maps or that connects to the SDG Target 2.1, which reads in part end all forms of malnutrition, including achieving targets on stunting and wasting in children under 5 years of age, and addressing nutritional needs of adolescent girls, pregnant women, and lactating women and older persons. So there's definitely a conceptual connection between the disclosure topic of health and nutrition that is part of the processed food industry standard in SASB and what the Target 2.1 is trying to achieve, which is end all forms of malnutrition. However, when you actually look at the accounting metric beneath the health and nutrition topic, and you can read it there, revenue from products labeled and are marketed to promote health and nutrition attributes. That's the SASB accounting metric. There's no connection between that accounting metric from the SASB side and the indicator on the SDG side of things that reads prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity in the population. So what this table is trying to convey is that the SASB standards might have connections at the disclosure topic level to the target SDG level, but the SASB standards, and more specifically, the SASB accounting metrics were not designed to measure progress towards the achievement of the SDGs. So again, this is very important. The connections are made at the disclosure topic level on a more conceptual basis, and the accounting metrics in the SASB universe should not be thought of as KPIs to measure progress towards the SDGs, because they were not constructed with that goal in mind. So let me go a little bit into the results of our mapping efforts. And this is one of my favorite slides from these exercise, because it shows that there's a high degree of interconnectivity between the SDGs and the SASB standards. And we actually measure that degree of interconnectivity in two directionalities, from the SASB side to the SDGs and from the SDGs to the SASB side. So on that first directionality, 98% of the SASB industry-specific disclosure topics mapped to one or more SDG targets. And you might be wondering which SASB disclosure topics are actually part of that 2% that do not map to the SDGs. And the answer to that is we have topics within several industries in the SASB standards. And it so happens that animal welfare is not an issue that is explicitly mentioned in the SDGs. So that's that 2% that you see there missing. Then on the other directionality, 66% or 2/3 of the SDG targets map to one or more SASB industry-specific disclosure topic. So again, there's definitely a high degree of interconnectivity here, and that's good news for everybody that wants to overlay this financial materiality lens on the SDG framework.
So the previous slide showed the degree of interconnectivity in general, but it is important to understand that this degree of interconnectivity also varies by goal. And this basically means that some SDGs are more closely connected to the SASB standards than others. This is to be expected because, of course, the SDG framework was constructed with public policy and multilateral action in mind, where companies and private capital could potentially contribute to some SDGs, but not others. This is clear here in this slide, where you can see that there's a higher overlap with some SDGs than others. This table shows first the number of targets within each goal, how many targets have an overlap with the SASB standards, and the percentage of that overlap. You can see with in the higher overlap side, you can see that SDG number 3, SDG number 7, SDG number 11, and SDG number 12 are highly interconnected with the SASB standards. SDG number 3 focuses on good health and well-being. SDG number 7 focuses on affordable and clean energy. SDG number 11 touches upon sustainable cities and communities. And SDG number 12 focuses on responsible consumption and production. So these are highly interconnected SDGs with the SASB framework. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, there are certain SDGs that don't have that high degree of interconnectivity. And for example, you can think of SDG number 4, which focuses on quality of education, SDG number 16, which focuses on peace, justice, and strong institutions, and SDG number 17, which focuses on creating partnerships for the goals. As you can see again from the results in this table, these SDGs are not particularly aligned or interconnected with the SASB standards like others are. So the main message from this table and this slide is that companies will be better positioned to align their operations to certain SDGs and are likely to face challenges addressing certain SDG targets in the context of their core business strategies and products and services. Meanwhile, from the investor side, investors may find ample opportunities to try to impact certain SDGs, while they may find limited opportunity to generate market rate returns through investment vehicles geared towards other SDG themes, even when investable solutions are available for those themes. This slide here shows that the degree of interconnectivity not only varies by goal, like we just saw, but it also varies by SASB sector or industry. First, let me explain what you're seeing in this slide. The gray bars show the number of SDG target to SASB topic connections by sector and by goal. So basically, the bigger the gray bar, the bigger the number of target to SASB topic connections there are for any particular goal and sector. This basically means that some SDGs will be highly relevant to value creation for certain sectors and industries and business models, while at the same time being largely irrelevant to others. One very evident result is SDG number 12. As a reminder, SDG number 12 focuses on responsible production and consumption. And as you can see, all the SASB sectors have a high degree of interconnectivity with that particular goal. There are a lot of topics within those sectors and the industries within those sectors that have a direct connection with responsible production and consumption. I want to bring your attention to other two sectors just to drive this point home. First of all, let me focus on SDG number 3. SDG number 3, as a reminder, focuses on improving health and well-being. So it is not surprising that the healthcare sector is the sector, the SASB sector, that is most aligned with that particular SDG. This is not a a result that surprises anybody. It's expected, but it shows in a simple manner what these table is trying to convey. That certain sectors, of course, have a higher degree of interconnectivity with certain SDGs. The other example that I wanted to bring into your attention is SDG number 11. As you can see, SDG number 11 highly overlaps with the infrastructure sector. And again, this is to be expected because SDG number 11 focuses on sustainable cities and communities. So there are many opportunities for companies participating in the infrastructure sector to align their activities, their operations, their products and services with SDG number 11 and its accompanying targets. This slide here shows the SASB disclosure topics for the automobile industry. If you were to go into the SASB website and download the free standard for the automobile industry, you would see that that standard includes 5 disclosure topics. And what this table is showing is that these disclosure topics map to different SDG targets, SDG goals. And let me just point to a couple of examples to show how we at SASB made these connections. So you can look at the first row there. The SASB topic is product safety, which of course in the context of the automobile industry is automobile safety. And you see that that particular disclosure topic is connected to SDG Target 3.6. This target reads in part, achieving a reduction in 50% in the number of global deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents. So there's definitely a connection, conceptual connection between what the SASB disclosure topic is trying to capture and measure through its accounting metrics and what the SDG target description is, describing. Similarly, you can think of the SASB disclosure topic of fuel economy and use phase emissions and see how that is connected with SDG goal number 12, in particular SDG 12.2, which reads in part, achieving the sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. Of course, in the context of the automobile industry, those natural resources would be, of course, fuel. So again, there's definitely a conceptual connection between what the SASB disclosure topic is trying to capture and measure through its accounting metrics and the SDG goals and targets.
I'm going to skip this slide here. It's kind of the same idea, but for another industry. This is the processed food industry.
Another thing that you can do with the SASB SDG mapping is actually look at those connections from the other perspective. And this is what this slide is showing. Instead of looking at which disclosure topics within an industry map to certain SDGs, we're looking at which industries map to a given SDG target. And the focus of this slide is, again, SDG Target 3.6, which was that target that focused on reducing global deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents. We already know from a couple of slides ago that that particular SDG target maps to the automobile industry via the product safety topic. But you can see here that there are additional SASB disclosure topics and SASB industries where that particular SDG target might be relevant. And it's not surprising to see that many of these industries are part of the transportation sector in the SASB universe. And you can see there air freight and logistics, car rental and leasing, rail transportation, road transportation, etc. And of course, the different disclosure topics within those industries that have these connections to these SDG target. What's interesting to understand from this slide is that SASB's unique industry-specific lens means that the connections between these industries and a given SDG target happen via different in different contexts, if you will. For say automobile and auto parts, we're looking at product safety, right? These are manufacturing companies and assembling companies that put together the cars that may impact or may connect with SDG 3.6 via these operations and product safety in particular. But in the context of these other industries that are more service oriented, the connection is not necessarily on the product side, but actually is found in how they manage accident and safety considerations in their day-to-day operations. So again, SASB's industry-specific lens is at play here, and it is very important to understand these industry-specific context, to fully understand how these industries are connected to these SDGs.
Here, this is another example of what that, another example looking at a given SDG target. This is SDG Target 11.4, which focuses on efforts to protect So you can see that there's a lot of industries there that whose operations are aligned to this particular SDG, and they are aligned via different SASB disclosure topics. So I want to bring your attention to maybe the metals and mining industry. There's 3 particular SASB disclosure topics in there that are related or connected to SDG Target 11.4. One of which is biodiversity impacts, which of course relates to the safeguarding of the natural heritage portion of the SDG. And the other 2 relate to social aspects, right? Community relations and the rights of indigenous peoples, which of course relate to the cultural portion of the SDG.
From the investor side, we hope that our exercise mapping the SASB disclosure topics to the SDG targets helps investors identify financially relevant SDGs by industry. We also hope that it informs engagements with companies regarding the links between specific SDGs and company financial performance and enterprise value creation, and in so doing reduce rainbow washing. And we also hope that it informs capital allocation strategies that are based or hope to impact specific SDG targets. On the company side, we also believe that our mapping effort will help companies identify SDG targets that are financially relevant by industry. And in so doing, this will help, hopefully, prioritize activities to address these SDGs via company operations and the rendering of services and design of products. Finally, we hope that companies use these exercises to gather decision useful performance information on company specific activities related to key SDGs.
And finally, I'll just wrap things up, reminding everybody that we have created a paper that's titled Industry Guide to the Sustainable Development Goals that you can download from our Knowledge Hub with more results and samples than what we have seen here. And with that, I'll just end my presentation and give time for the other speakers to contribute.
Thanks so much, Arturo, and I apologize. We're doing our best to work this connection. Arturo, maybe you and Gary can use the chat and see if it might be possible. Maybe you need to connect in via phone, but I would like you to keep those slides handy in case we have to come back to them. I know folks have used the Q&A, and please continue to do that for questions as we go through. What we can't answer here, we will try to follow up through the speakers. And I would also mention that as the people that you see here put this session together, I think our conclusion was that we are very early in the process of trying to figure out how to make those SDGs actionable for investors. This is not going to be I shouldn't say it's not going to be an easy process, but it's going to take some time, and there's some real challenges. So one of the things we would like to do, if there are ideas, and as we go through the conversation, are the things that you and the audience hear and see and might want us to follow up on and look for ways to bring additional material and clarity to some of these things as we move forward. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over first to Rakhi and then to Ivka to talk about what this means to them in the work that they're doing. And I think when they have spoken and we'll go into a little bit of a conversation, but I think you'll see the challenges and the opportunities in trying to make use of these SDGs in an investment context. Rakhi?
Thank you, Michael. And just so that everyone knows, I am Rakhi Kumar. I head up Sustainability Solutions at Liberty Mutual, where I am tasked with, I'm leading efforts to incorporate sustainability across our enterprise. So that includes the operations, investments, and insurance. And prior to that, I've been at Liberty only 6 months. And prior to that, I was at State Street Global Advisors, where I was heading up the ESG investing business, as well as their stewardship program. So really my quest for trying to understand how first as an investor you could use the SDG frameworks, and now as a company to use the SDG frameworks. As an investor, it started in late 2016 when I was in Europe, and I started hearing about a lot of clients asking about the SDGs, etc. And it was pretty frustrating because when you came back and you looked at, what should we do and how can we align, the SDGs were really designed as a policy framework for governments and to have government action. And as you saw in Arturo's presentation, some of the fine detail on measurement and impact are really at the macro level, systemic level around poverty reduction and their specific goals. So if you're, how are you going to measure it? How are you going to report against it? Fast forward to 2020 now, and a lot has happened in the interim, and I think a big shift happened last year when the Business Roundtable came up with their statement on corporate purpose, and really stakeholder primacy became important. And then that resulted in, not just integrating sustainability, but actually creating an environment or letting ESG inform your strategy, right? And in this instance, especially particularly in Europe, you see a lot of corporations, a lot of investors looking at the SDGs as the world that they want to build and help build, and using the SDGs to inform their strategy and activities to build and accordingly start identifying the strategies that you are going to pursue. And what I liked about this paper, but still, how do you demonstrate impact? And I think what I liked about this paper is that as a company, it allows for me to say, okay, here are some core SDGs that my business is tied to or impacted with. And then I don't need to try to understand how to create that impact by going into the core results. It in some ways allows for me to say, okay, here are the SDGs that I think are important. And then I can continue to report against SASB, which is a framework that we're using currently in our reporting systems. Then it allows for investors who are pursuing UN SDG type products to evaluate performance or evaluate or assess how those SDGs are linked to performance and it allows them to measure progress. So I think in some ways it allows for that connection to make SDGs a usable framework for investors and companies without creating excessive additional work, which around reporting.
Thanks, Rakhi. Ivka?
Sure. So I'm Ivka Kalus, and I'm the CIO of Promethos Capital. We're a young boutique institutional manager, and our our investment strategies are all built around intentionally investing capital. And the reason for forming Promethos was that I and my partners all felt like there was this unmet need on the part of capital providers to basically put their money to work in the same way that they live their lives, so that over time their capital can drive change. And thinking about capital is the most efficient mechanism for valuing and pricing risk if you let it. And I think that the whole mission of first SRI investing, and then now ESG investing, and now moving on to the SDGs, is really about capturing externality risk, valuing externality risk, and bringing it forward into investment decision making. And those tools were not available 10 or 15 years ago. And the SASB work of evaluating materiality of ESG behaviors, and now the work of trying to map the SDGs onto the materiality matrix, pushes that effort forward in terms of being able to identify what those externalities are and create specific goals that, again, allow that capital to drive the change. And so we're really excited about it. I mean, as you pointed out, Michael, it's still early days, but what the SASB work has done, and now what the SDG work is contributing to, is building a consensus around how you measure the SDG goals, what the metrics are, how you measure them, and being able to measure things means you can manage those things. And so giving corporations as well as investors a consensus, or the ability to build consensus around what is important, how you measure it, and then therefore give you the ability to differentiate among investment opportunities. And that's how we build portfolios in general. But I think that because of the heavy lifting that SASB is doing to map the SDGs, and the work that the UN and everyone who is signing on to the compact is doing, it just makes our lives easier in terms of being able to quantify and reflect those specific goals in our portfolios, while also, because investors are looking at them and differentiating among them, also being able to capture the alpha opportunity that they represent. Because all else being equal, would I rather have in my mind, would I rather have the organic milk or the non-organic milk? I'm going to choose the organic milk because I think that it's better for me and it's better for the environment. And it's the same kind of thing is being able to distinguish among investment opportunities and building those into portfolios to reflect not only that intent, but also the alpha that traveling along that path to those goals provides. So it's a great start.
What would be, in your mind, the next steps needed, whether it's from the SASB side, whether it's from our side, investment side, and thinking about the SDGs? There are way too many standards and way too many frameworks. And there's a whole set that have been developed around sustainable development by the UN, looking at how to achieve those goals. But as been pointed out, these are policy, the SDGs are to guide governments. And what we really need, Rakhi, you made the point about corporations being able to adjust their strategy, and Ivka, the point about how we measure their performance. Where do we go next, or where should we look? Where should investors and where should investment professionals look next in terms of getting more and better information, being able to do more with this?
I mean, at this point, if from a critical, if I look at it critically, you look at most sustainability reports, almost all of them will bring up SDGs. Right? At least most companies are identifying SDGs. And I think what needs to happen, probably not from a SASB perspective. I think this report that you have is really going to help. In some ways, it's a framework of how investors can think about making the SDGs relevant from when they read it in a company report, and then asking the right questions for companies to start with. But I think also the work of, you know, the methodology, the methodology, and the ability to compare performance also comes in because of SASB. So I'm not sure where we should go from there, but I think a little bit more work around first promoting the framework, thinking of it as a framework, as Ivka said, it's a first step, and then using that as a framework to let investors actually start valuing and evaluating company linkage and holding companies accountable when they say that they're aligning to an SDG, instead of, you know, because as somebody calls it, rainbow washing now when you talk about SDGs. So
yeah, I mean, I think that there are reporting standards that are being developed. So the GRI is one, and now I think I just read yesterday, I forget who was pushing for common reporting, and so I think the next steps are just to either participate in that discussion or to pay attention to what the metrics are that are being reported, and then to try to do what SASB has been doing, which is to quantify, or at least to try to quantify the materiality. I mean, from our perspective, I guess, you know, the whole point of externalities is that they're separated from the activity in space and time. And so sometimes some of these SDGs are hard to ever quantify directly into financial performance. For example, diversity. If you work really hard on diversity and inclusion, where do you see that on your P&L or balance sheet or cash flow statement? You don't. But the reason that diversity is important intuitively is that it leads to a less groupthink, more innovation, more adaptability, more worker retention, and all of those things indirectly lead to better competitive performance. And so some of these things are hard to ever quantify directly, but we know that they lead in aggregate to either, you know, better long-term results when you look at the big numbers, or better risk management. And so keeping track of what those metrics are that are sort of rising up, and then also seeing how investors treat them. And I know that this is a bit of a tautology, but, you know, a lot of these metrics matter because investors say they matter. So they aren't necessarily coming through on next quarter's or next year's income line, but investors are saying, I believe that this matters, or my capital providers tell me that they want that in a portfolio, and therefore those metrics, I'm going to differentiate along those metrics, and then those metrics rise up. And so from a quantitative perspective, if we think about a lot of those metrics as factors, you can test them. You can once you can measure it, and once you have enough companies reporting, you can test whether or not those factors do indeed seem to deliver non-correlated information, otherwise known as alpha. and so I can share a screen real quickly. Just this is sort of where we are right now, but so early days, but there's an Italian team that used artificial intelligence and machine learning to test hundreds of ESG factors, which ESG factors are sort of those metrics that you can parse out and have enough data, looking for high or significant Sharpe ratios. And so these are the ones that they found to be statistically significant. So already you have all of these factors here, not only sort of emissions, waste, we have several that are related to diversity. So all of those can be mapped along with the SDGs that are already delivering alpha. So investors, when the question is, what should we do next? I think the what should we do now and constantly next is to stay on top of this and watch what the best thinkers are putting out there, and then we can just benefit from that as that information comes up, and as the market or as investors develop a consensus around how we are meant to measure and manage the SDGs. And then I'm going to stop share. There we go.
So I'm going back to Arturo's presentation and talking about companies where we talk about products and services, and then we talk about operations. Do you see those as falling into the domain of operations being more potentially negative impacts or avoidance of negative impacts, and the products and services being more correlated with positive contributions toward SDGs?
That's a great question. I've switched microphones, by the way, so hopefully this is better than before. But please do tell me if the audio is still choppy. But to your question, it really depends, like anything that SASB does in the context of the industry, right? There might be operations that create a positive impact when you actually think about industries like renewable energy, right? We have standards for wind energy and wind project developers, as well as solar energy and solar project developers. So the actual business operations of those types of companies might have a positive impact on an SDG or be positively aligned to an SDG. And that might be the opposite for another industry. We saw that, chemicals example in that slide that I presented on waste. It's likely that chemical companies, if they're performing badly or mismanaging waste in a way that's obvious, they might have negative externalities on that particular SDG. So that's on the operation side, right? On the product side, it's kind of the same idea. If you're producing electric vehicles, you might be positively aligned to the responsible consumption of fuel by producing electric or hybrid types of cars. But if you think of another industry in the hydrocarbon space, that might be the opposite. So again, it really depends on the industry context, which is, of course, one of the values that SASB brings into the table, that industry-specific understanding of risks and opportunities, as well as the other big element of our framework, which is financial materiality.
Yeah, can I just add to that, Michael? Because I think it's kind of interesting when you say that, because when so the product side is what companies do, right? And then the operation side is how they do it. And I know that ESG world sort of started with just what companies do. SRI world was very exclusionary, sort of banning certain activities from a portfolio. ESG 1.0 was looking at how companies operate, looking for best-in-class practices. But and I think that what's really great about this is that it combines the two, and it depends on what you want to achieve with the portfolio. And so the poster child is the energy sector, right? Which Arturo just pointed out. So it creates a lot of negative externalities in terms of the product, but the opportunity to to mitigate those externalities is perhaps the highest in the energy sector because of both operating practices and how much you can mitigate CO2 pollution just in terms of how you operate, and also because these industries have huge cash flows that they can reinvest and use their tremendous cash to reinvest in, say, wind farms and solar farms. And so you can see a conversion of a sector where it was always associated with a product that is a negative externality, and no one really paid attention to the operational side, which could be a huge opportunity in terms of a positive alignment with SDGs. And so I think that the framework, along with what SASB has done, allows you to do that in a more systematic way than just sort of anecdotal, which was, again, going back to SRI and ESG investing 1.0.
And Rakhi, on your side, I mean, a company like Liberty Mutual is obviously a large investor, but also as an insurer, you deal with a lot of industries around the world. So how do you look at that, operations versus business?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, from a climate perspective, we have identified two of the SDGs as something that is aligned to our business. So the affordable and clean energy, as well as climate action. And so we're taking a very strategic approach to addressing climate change and the climate challenge. And it has resulted in our expanding the amount of, our allocation to capital to private renewable investments. So our renewable book of business, our underwriting of renewable projects has, since 2017, we've identified $1 billion or allocated $1 billion in private renewable investments, and that has resulted in contributing to the generation of electricity equal to powering 7.5 million homes. In addition, we have also provided 25 million to one of the fastest growing residential solar and energy storage provider. And then we've reduced our unfunded exposures to oil and gas and traditional energy sectors by 50% over a 5-year period. And so our allocation of capital is being looked at. But as I said, it's all about strategy, right? So we have this UN SDG goal, but it is informing our strategy, and then we're incorporating it and taking action accordingly.
All right, Ivka, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Just from a company standpoint, I mean, we're small. We're a team of 6 people, and so I think our primary SDG goal as a firm is to be diverse by design. And again, I talked about the benefits of diversity, and it is an SDG goal. And our industry, asset management, is actually the least diverse industry there is. As you go up the scale, only 1.3% of assets are managed by women and minorities in the US. And we know that diversity, again, contributes significantly to innovation and to adaptability. And so we feel like our industry has done a terrible job of taking advantage of the diverse talents that is out there. And so that is one of our goals. And so we have a majority women and minority team. And we have a very active internship program where we've had now almost 24 interns come through, women and people of color, to give them their first opportunity to participate in this industry, and therefore to then be able to move on to perhaps larger companies that are looking for more diverse candidates. And so that's our own individual SDG goal as Promethos, besides biking to work and and limiting our carbon output.
So I'm going to ask one final question of Arturo and Rakhi, and if please feel free to weigh in. But I think we're Liberty is obviously global. We're thinking globally, but the United States and investors and firms here are behind certainly on a lot of these things, certainly interest and engagement in SDGs, and Europe, I think, would be perceived as being further ahead. Arturo, to what extent was this, how was this received? Was it received differently by investors and others in Europe than what you've seen here? What was the reaction?
Sure, that's a great question. So like anything like SASB does, we sought feedback from both companies and investors globally. And our conversations with the European investors and companies were particularly interested because they helped us understand that what our mapping effort wasn't. So I go back to that particular slide on this topic where we thought that some of our industry, some of our accounting metrics, or most of them for that matter, could be considered as a way to understand impact on the SDGs. And by having these conversations with the European, we realized that was the case. So that was really, really helpful from a European perspective. So that's a piece of anecdotal evidence, information there for you guys. That was before, of course, we created the final version of the mapping. So after we published our publication and the final version of the mapping, the feedback has been pretty positive. Again, just understanding this mapping as a conceptual link between the connections between the SASB disclosure topics and those targets really helps to try to overlay this financial materiality and industry-specific lens to the SDGs. And I think this is something that is the participants of the capital markets have been wanting for a long time, whether that's in the US or in Europe or in other regions of the world. So once that those connections and that crosswalk was out there, it was well received.
So we did lose part of that, Arturo, but I'm not going to ask you to repeat the whole thing. But thank you. So let me close by asking Rakhi and Ivka, having started and being wrestling with these, what would be your one piece of advice to folks kind of watching and saying, okay, I see this is interesting because I'm interested in what SASB does. I have some engagement with it. I'm interested whether I'm interested in the SDGs as an economic opportunity, investment opportunity. What would be your one next step you would suggest for people who are trying to enter into this after having heard this today and based on what you've done?
I mean, from a company perspective, I think the next step is, if you are not reporting against SASB to the extent, and then actually using this mapping to identify and help measure your performance against the metric is a useful start. And I think if you're an investor, if I'm wearing an investor hat on, one of the things investors can do is actually start using the SASB reporting to, as they're building portfolios and trying to align to UN SDGs, they identify different companies in different sectors to, I guess, create that tile, the 17 tiles, and then identify companies through performance of like outperformers. And so you could, use it for your, to create different strategies.
I would say stay tuned and read as much as possible. Read Arturo's paper. There's a paper came out. Arturo mentioned these guys in his paper, True Value, which is more of a contemporaneous information scraping AI tool that looks for contemporaneous information. And they're starting to map SDGs on top of how they typically, they use the SASB framework materiality, looking for what is coming out in the global press, 40,000 news sources, to see what's out there that companies aren't self-reporting, because a lot of SDG data, most of it is self-reported. And so to be able to actually look contemporaneously at what companies are actually doing based on what's picked up by the news wires and small local papers. And so watch this evolve, because I think that until now, or until pretty recently, there was a lot of pushback in our industry against ESG, SRI, SDGs as being something to incorporate into investment discipline because it was not concrete and did not map onto standard financial accounting or into accounting standards. And now that world is changing. And so I would say read as much as you can and just take advantage of the body of knowledge that is growing exponentially around this and enabled by the work that our Arturo is doing to make it real so that we as practitioners can really create portfolios that can incorporate the intent that most capital providers want incorporated in how their money is invested.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. Arturo, Rakhi, and Ivka, thank you very much. I will quote you in terms of staying tuned. And with that, I'll also suggest to Denise and Eric, as we think about what else can be done to support the SASB FSA community, that there's probably opportunities going forward from here. So again, thank you all very much for helping us put this together and take the first steps on this long journey. Thank you. Good afternoon.